Hi, this is Barry. Welcome to the Simplicity Zen podcast. Today I'm joined by Robert Epstein. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Barry. Nice to be here.
Your Dharma name's Koho, is that correct?
That is correct.
And what does that mean?
Koho means bright Dharma.
Okay.
And it's one of those names that you have to try to live up to, I guess.
Right. I think my Dharma name was more of a warning. That's something that I live up to. Could you tell us a little bit about kind of your current teaching and practice context, just so people can understand who you are and why we're talking about all this?
Sure. I'm currently one of the teachers at Open Mind Zen, which is in Melbourne, Florida. I'm in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
So my teaching is at the moment due to geographical considerations, as well as the COVID period that we've been going through, is all online at the moment. Mm-hmm. I'm one of the rotating teachers online with OMZ, Open Mind Zen. So I come around about every, I think, 9 or 10 weeks to be the person to give the talk and lead the meditation, lead the Zazen session.
You're a lay teacher, is that correct? You're not ordained?
I am a lay teacher, mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I also have my own group time on Saturdays at 1 p.m., which it was in person originally before COVID, but is now online, and for the time being appears to be staying online. And
this is through Open Mind Zen.
And that's also under the auspices of Open Mind Zen. It's sort of like the amorphous version of Open Mind Zen Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. But since it's online, it doesn't have a very firm DC identity. So, and we have a very small group that we don't meet every Saturday. So mm-hmm. I've asked people to email me to find out if we're on, if they want to come. And that's, so we're doing a couple of 2 to 3 Saturdays a month or something like that.
Great. What do you do professionally?
Professionally, I'm an acting teacher. And at the present time, I'm doing all my teaching online as well. So, and I've been teaching a particular form of acting technique. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit more later. Called the Meisner Technique. Okay. And I've been teaching that technique for approximately 35 plus years. So I've been teaching it for a while.
Okay. As we go along, at some point, I want to talk to you about how, what sparked your interest in acting and so forth. Sure. Before we get to that, can you talk a little bit about where you grew up, kind of what your early family was like and so forth?
Sure. I was born, as I would say, if I wasn't monitoring my accent. Mm-hmm. That's also an acting thing. It's like how much New York accent do you have? Mm-hmm. I was born in New York Hospital in Manhattan, mm-hmm. and lived in Brooklyn for the first 9 or 10 years of my life. Then we in a housing project in Canarsie, Brooklyn, Canarsie. Mm-hmm. Then we moved to South Jamaica, Queens, another interesting place. And I stayed there through, I guess, middle school or whatever you'd call it. And then we moved to Great Neck, Long Island. Mm-hmm. And first time I ever experienced having a house instead of an apartment.
Epstein, is that Jewish?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How observant were your parents? Were they Reform or conservative or?
A kind of interesting family. My parents were devout atheists. Mm-hmm. So they believed fervently in not believing in religion. Mm-hmm. And we were sort of a left-leaning family, part of a leftist community. Mm-hmm. So they were active activists to some extent. Mm-hmm. And I myself was active in the anti-war movement, and as a family, we were involved with the civil rights movement. Went to the March on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm. Were you born? How old are you?
when we went to the march, I think I was 8 years old and experienced it on my dad's shoulders.
Oh, wow. I thought you were closer to my age. I think acting has treated you well.
Yeah, I don't disclose my exact age, although people can calculate it if they want to.
Would your family, even though they were atheists, would they participate in Jewish rites?
Well, that's part of the complexity. Yeah, I should explain that. My grandmother on my father's side was an Orthodox Jew. Mm-hmm. Her husband, my grandfather, was a total, leftist atheist. Mm-hmm. So they coexisted in some way, and the kids all became non-religious atheists. But I did have a bar mitzvah, which is the coming of age ceremony in the Jewish tradition. I actually studied Hebrew for 6 months and learned Hebrew for a short period of time, which I then forgot. I've done that with a few things. I've learned them rather well and then forgotten them completely. But I did the bar mitzvah in Hebrew, reading the real Hebrew, and I sort of did that for my grandmother's benefit, but I actually enjoyed the experience a lot. And it was a nice ritual.
Would you guys do like Passover and Hanukkah and all that?
We celebrated the Jewish holidays, and more of a cultural thing than a religious thing, but the history of the Jewish people and the things that the Jews have gone through is in a way both a cultural thing and is also part of the tradition of protest and being oppressed and being a part of the minority community. So it has social significance as well. But we celebrate all, and if you look at the Jewish holidays, there are a lot about that, Passover, about the wandering in the desert and all that kind of thing, and getting away from being slaves in Egypt. And Hanukkah is about a battle where, again, the Jewish warriors were fighting against their oppressors, and they had a miracle of having the oil last for 8 days instead of 2 days. So there's a lot of social activism in the Jewish holidays. So yeah, we would celebrate those. On my mother's side, my grandparents were Christian Scientists, just to make things more interesting. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask, did that trickle down to your family at all?
Yeah, my mother completely rejected it. So whatever religious affiliation the grandparents had, both of my parents kind of, didn't want to have anything to do with it. The main influence that Christian Science had on me is that my grandfather, who was sort of a rather prominent person in the Christian Science church in Brooklyn, he every time I would go to visit them, he would take me aside into the darkened living room, have me sit in a chair, and he'd sit across from me and look at me really seriously and say, so how's your inner life? This is from the time I was a little kid, and I had no idea what he was talking about. I thought maybe he's talking about, is my digestion okay or something? Yeah. So I would always say, okay, I'm doing all right. Yeah.
You think that planted any seeds?
I'm sorry?
You think that planted any seeds?
I think it did. It sparked a kind of interest because I wondered at that young age, what is this inner life thing about? And when I think about it now, I haven't really thought about this before, but sitting across from each other and having to answer that question, kind of my first dokusan.
Right. Yeah. Did other than preparing for your bar mitzvah, did you ever go to the synagogue?
Not too much. I think that we may have attended one or two other bar mitzvahs and gone to the temple for that purpose.
And what's your stance on gefilte fish?
I like it.
You do? Me too.
Yeah,
I thought I was the only one.
I'm a fan. Are you Jewish as well?
No, but I had two very close friends growing up in Maryland who were Jewish. So I would, frequently over at their house. So I mean, I would, in some ways, I was almost like,
you got indoctrinated,
raised Jewish. Yeah. And thinking about it, I've never really thought about this before, but I'm thinking about how many like really good teachers there are that are Jewish, and I think much greater than the per capita they are in American society. I mean, what do you think attracts so many Jewish people to Zen? or do you think my anecdotal observation is not correct?
Well, I think that in terms of Buddhism in general, obviously Zen is said to be outside the scriptures, and in a certain way to be beyond words and phrases.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an awful lot of talking in Zen history for a silent tradition.
Right, yeah.
You know, all the koans are about excerpts from lengthy dialogues for the most part,
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's Joshu, who is pretty terse sometimes.
Right.
But I think that there's an intellectual tradition in Judaism that, you know, leads to a lot of curiosity and speculation about the nature of reality and the nature of the universe. And a lot of Buddhism has a lot of, you know, very weighty analysis and sort of investigation of the nature of things. I think that's appealing to the Jewish mind, perhaps.
Interesting. So when you were a kid and, you know, kind of tween, pre-teenager, were you kind of happy-go-lucky? Were you thinking about deep matters of life and death? You know, kind of what was your mental state around that age?
Yeah, I was a combination of being sort of seeming kind of wild and crazy on the outside and kind of thoughtful and philosophical on the inside. I didn't always, and I had friends who I would, you know, talk to about, you know, deeper things, but I like to run around and act crazy in high school. and I would write poetry and I would, you know, spout a little philosophy. And so I had a very active intellectual life, but my social behavior was a little bit more wild.
Were you skipping classes and partying and stuff like that?
No, I was a good student. I remember one time I came home with a B in English, and my mom gave me a really hard time. Why did you get a B? How did that happen? You know, it's in English. That's like your best subject. You know, I was like, well, Mom, it's a B. It's not a D.
Right.
So I was basically a straight A student, but I didn't want to have that image, so I would misbehave a little bit to try to temper it. And I like to hang out with different types of people. I would hang out with you know, I came from Brooklyn and Queens, so in Great Neck, everybody seemed pretty, you know, not very threatening to me. So I would hang out with the tough guys, you know, and smoke a cigarette at a young age. And then I would hang out with the people who were into art and music and stuff, and I would hang out with them. So I would go around to different kinds of groups and have different kinds of fun with different gangs.
Did you have any touch points to Asian culture, like martial arts or Eastern philosophy or Eastern poetry or anything like that as a teenager?
Yeah, I studied judo when I was little, and I can hardly remember it now because it was really at a young age. But I really enjoyed that and got into the kind of the flow of judo and the kind of consciousness that you had to be in order to do that successfully without getting smashed. And and that was a lot of fun. So that was the beginning of sort of an Eastern interest. And then I ran across Alan Watts, as many a person did back then. And I read a book of Alan Watts. It was Psychotherapy East and West was one that was very interesting.
Oh, okay.
And there was another one that was, I don't remember which one, but anyway, I was reading about the Eastern idea of enlightenment. And that
this is a teenager or college?
Yeah, around 15.
Okay.
And I was thinking, you know, enlightenment, what is that? You know, this state that was, you know, beyond everything and that was very freeing. And Watts, for whatever flaws he might have, he had a poetic way of describing that. And I thought, that's really interesting. You know, I'd like to find out more about that. And it did sort of spark a lifelong interest in looking into the Eastern spiritual arts and martial arts as well. Talk about that.
Is that something? Did that upwelling kind of happen right away, or was that kind of bookmark in your head and you kind of came back to it later?
Well, I think I maintained my interest in it, but I wasn't actively pursuing it. Although now, along with the judo, a little bit later on, when I was in high school, somebody came around and initiated a bunch of us into TM.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and so I was practicing TM for a little while when I was 16 or 17.
Mm-hmm.
And I must have been sort of primed to do
Mm-hmm.
one or another spiritual path, because I had very strange experiences doing TM, and that's why, and I stopped. They were strong enough that I stopped.
Could you describe those a little bit?
I would sort of, TM was, the mantra was very powerful for me. I don't know exactly how that works, but I mean, it was because I've done mantra work of other kinds that weren't that powerful, but it would like throw me into samadhi, very quickly. And I remember thinking at the time, I don't think that something should be able to do that to you that deeply without you understanding what it is. So I got a little wary of it, and I was having some weird city type experiences too on it. Like I could see with my eyes closed. So I thought, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, is a little too much too fast.
Yeah.
Did did you get any relaxation or central nervous system kind of rebalancing or any of that from it, or is it just
I liked it a lot. I liked it a lot. It was very pacifying, and I tend to be a fairly anxious person, so the fact that something could just kind of calm you down. And but there are different kinds of samadhi, and the feeling of this was like going under. It was almost like being anesthetized to a certain extent. So it wasn't like the kind of discriminative awake awareness that the Buddha describes in the jhanas, keeping your mind awake. It was more like, it's okay, you can go to sleep.
There are, the formless jhanas, like 5 and 6, where it's no time, no space and stuff like that. So maybe it was, kind of that on that level.
Yeah, I also think that there are yogic samadhi states that are more like what some of the Zen masters complained about over the years, where they were pacifying rather than illuminating. So you could put yourself into a peaceful state where you'd be much happier for a while, but you weren't really gaining any insight or awakening from it.
Yeah.
And you came back, you'd have all the same defilements, as they're called, or whatever you want to call them, when you came back out.
So it's almost like an opiate.
Yeah, exactly.
What did you have any kind of deep existential angst as a teenager, or were you not really thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I had inner feelings of insecurity and self-consciousness. I mean, I was, sort of sensitive person, and I would perceive things and magnify them. So I suffered internally to a decent extent, even though, I was having a good time at the same time, but underneath it, I also had a lot of feelings of doubt and insecurity, which I didn't acknowledge until later. I used to act cool to cover it over. And as a matter of fact, I'll just throw in parenthetically, my daughter, who's now in her 20s, she saw a picture of me, and I also was, from the time I was 15 or 16, I was playing saxophone, and I was in a couple of bands. And my daughter saw a picture of me with long bushy hair and playing the saxophone, and I think I had a cigarette at the same time, which I don't have anymore, thank you.
Yeah.
And she looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at me and she said, "Dad, you used to be so cool. What happened to you?"
Yeah, so the music, especially jazz, I mean, that can kind of lead to kind of some flow states. Did you have that kind of experience playing music?
Playing music, I felt great. I loved playing jazz. I discovered jazz when I was also about 15, and my cousin sold me his saxophone for $100. He was finished with it, and I've had it ever since. I have the same one.
Oh, that's it.
It's a King Super 20, which is kind of a special sax that they don't make anymore, tenor sax. But yeah, I naturally took to music at a young age. I studied guitar when I was 9, played guitar and played folk guitar and sang from the time I was 9. Then I started playing jazz when I was 15, and I took clarinet lessons as well for about 10 years, classical clarinet lessons. Today, I'm back to experimenting on the saxophone again, and playing piano as well. And I play every day. I've got my collection. I only play tenor sax most of the time because I don't have enough time, but I have a clarinet, a bass clarinet, an alto sax, tenor sax, and a soprano sax.
Wow.
And a piano and guitar.
Would you play in a band?
Would I?
I don't know, did you at the time?
Did I? Yeah, I played in a high school band and a college band. And I was the sax and clarinet player in the high school band, and I was a sax player and singer in the college band.
Any other interesting anecdotes or stories, or you think relevant data points from your teenage years before we can move on to college?
In the teenage years before we move on to college?
Yeah.
I would say mostly the music, really, is that I was very involved with both playing with the band and playing piano and sax, and very immersed in the musical world. I also wrote a lot of poetry, and that was important to me too. And I had some friends that were like-minded, who were artistic / philosophical, who went on to do some artistic things. Some of them became musicians, and one of them is a filmmaker. So it was an interesting group and an interesting time, playing music, writing poetry, that kind of thing.
If you're comfortable talking about it, did you experiment with psychedelics at all during this time?
That we put that in the college section.
All right, so moving on to college, did you go locally, or did you leave town, or what did you do?
I went to, I was in high school. I was in what was called the community school in Great Neck North Senior High. So that was my high school. When I went to, and it was kind of an experimental to a certain degree. When I went to college, I went to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. And that was a really kind of differently structured, they called it an experimenting college rather than experimental. But basically, it was sort of almost like grad schoolish rather than baccalaureate. They'd have you do a project in 4 different areas, then select one to concentrate on in the middle years, and then do the equivalent of a thesis in your final year. So I love that school. That was a great experience. I was doing a bunch of different interesting activities there. I was focusing on philosophy. So
that was your major, or whatever the equivalent is.
Yeah, they call it your concentration, but you can call it a major. So yeah, I majored in philosophy, and I studied, particularly interested in phenomenology, as developed by the German philosopher Edmund Husserl and the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty.
Could you explain a little bit about what phenomenology is?
Yeah, it's probably the area of philosophy that's closest to Zen and mindfulness types of disciplines, because it was very much based in the idea that the reality of what you experience comes from you as a subject. And so your subjectivity kind of creates the meanings that you experience perceptually, and how you form those all together into a kind of gestalt of what you consider the world to be and how you navigate through it. So it's kind of in Merleau-Ponty's case, it's a very meticulous kind of investigation of how that takes place and how that influences our understanding of reality. And rather than saying that there's, subjectivity and objectivity, they said there's subjectivity and there's intersubjectivity, where there's kind of a social agreement between individuals or groups of people about the nature of reality. And we're able to perceive things and talk about them in a similar way because of our shared understandings of them. So it was a very subjectivity-based kind of.
Sounds like it's kind of almost approaching Yogacara in a way.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent. I don't know if they ever denied the existence of physical reality, and I don't know if Yogacara does either. But
not totally, but yeah,
some parts of it seem to. But the idea that rather than mind only, maybe it's more like mind very. There's just they would look at it from that standpoint, and they would say that there's not necessarily an objective reality, although they never said that the physical world doesn't exist or anything like that.
So did you, so I guess there was some experimenting with psychedelics?
Yeah, the psychedelics went really well with the philosophy because, and that's the type of person I was. I would, take mushrooms, which are probably the best and most benign example of those kinds of drugs. And although they can be very powerful, but it doesn't sort of completely overwhelm the mind. And I would sit around and go, I had some experiences with other people too, and had some fun, but I remember one time in particular sitting around and going like, oh, I was reading about how the perception is constructed, this way. And now I can actually see it being formed up. Here's how the perceptions are being formed. I can watch the process.
Oh, wow.
So I thought that was pretty fascinating.
That is cool. And so the Grateful Dead came through the Northeast Lottery that time. Do you ever go see them?
I didn't see the Dead at that time. I did have some decent music experiences. One of the best ones was seeing Tom Waits in the early days. And that was with and he had like a jazz band with him. Great voice to hear in person. I didn't see the Dead with Garcia. I think I saw them years later after.
Right. Were you into some of the more out there jazz like Coltrane or Thelonious Monk or any of those guys?
Yeah, my influences in jazz were pretty much Charlie Parker, during the bebop phase, then Coltrane, sort of like pretty much following the history of jazz. And then the more outside stuff like Eric Dolphy, who was sort of my idol. And there was, Archie Shepp was playing in that area. He lived and taught in the valley there, and a bunch of the jazz guys, heavy duty jazz guys, were at UMass. So there was a program at UMass being run by some pretty famous guys. I studied with some pretty avant-garde guys over in UMass. I took a course there and played saxophone and studied with Marion Brown and Stanley Cowell, who were a couple of really interesting players at that time. And they gave me some positive feedback, which I appreciated. They said I played like the old guys. They said I sounded like a little bit like Ben Webster and Coleman Hawkins at the time, which I thought, wow, okay.
What did you think of the fusion stuff like Bitches Brew and Herbie Hancock and stuff like that?
I'm glad you brought that up. I was never in love with Bitches Brew and the stuff that was more free floating. It didn't seem to really. It had some interesting things in it, but didn't seem to really go anywhere. The stuff I really liked was what Miles did before that, when he introduced the world to Herbie Hancock, Tony Williams, Wayne Shorter, originally George Coleman, and then Wayne Shorter, and Ron Carter. That his second quintet, which played My Funny Valentine and Stella by Starlight, Stella, which I'm working on right now, I'm playing really crazily on. But I that's what I go back to. I love that the kind of soloing that band did and the way they coordinated with each other was absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of ways, that music, I think, kind of manifests Zen mind. I mean, it really is, all about the flow and in the moment. I mean, not to be too cliche about it, but I mean, there's really something there.
No, those guys were really like that. I mean, they were, you could say it was an embodied Zen exercise in a way, whether they were aware of it that way or not, but they were like 100% attuned to each other and the music and the moment. And there was a funny story. Wayne Shorter would play all these amazing figures and things, and he was very spontaneous and had a very creative vocabulary. And Herbie was there on the piano, playing with him when he was soloing, and he would take a little figure that that Wayne Shorter had done, and he played on the piano. And they would like go back and forth and develop the solo together. And Miles, Miles once said to him, "How come you play all those little things for Wayne and you don't do it with me?"
Right.
And I don't think Kirby said anything, but he sort of implied that, well, things you're playing aren't the same.
Yeah. You know, so I mean, I don't want to bore non-jazz fans too much, but it's really interesting. Coltrane's, I forget which song, but one of the Coltrane, one of the core solos by Coltrane on Kind of Blue. Coltrane actually practiced that. Like, it sounds improvised, but he really, really practiced that. Like crazy before playing it, even though it kind of sounds off the cuff to some degree.
There's another good story like that too, which is they took when they were on tour, and he was playing giant steps a lot, and which I've also been working on a lot lately. And I think I've played giant steps about 500 times over the last 5 years. But and they go to the hotel room, and the guys would say, "Hey, John, we're going to go down and have some lunch. You want to come?" He says, "No, I think I'll play scales for a while." So he'd hang out in the hotel room and he's playing over the changes of giant steps very slowly. Then they come up later and say, "Hey, we're going to go get some dinner. You want to come?" So, "No, I'm going to play a little more." And he'd play a little bit faster, and he's still practicing over the changes. And then finally, he'd keep on speeding up till they got to the to the concert, and then he'd play full speed. So he was working on those patterns continuously. The similar story with Eric Dolphy, just really quickly, is that they take him to a party, and he didn't want to go, but they made him go, and then he disappeared. He said, "Where's Eric?" And they found him in the coat room, playing bass clarinet in the corner. Playing
he was just all in.
Yeah,
it's great.
I think they both were.
So you did a little TM in high school. Did you do any formal meditation, or I guess even informal meditation in college?
In college, I started studying Tai Chi, and I continued my study for a couple of years of the time I was there, maybe the whole time, 2 or 3 years. And with a guy named Paul Gallagher, who was a disciple of Master Liang, who's one of the Yang style Tai Chi teachers. And he was a very serious Taoist teacher, and happened to be in that area, so he was teaching at the colleges. But I learned the entire long form Yang style, which people generally don't bother with these days. They're more likely to learn the short form, which is a lot easier to learn and to practice, because the long form takes quite a while. This is one of the things that I learned and then forgot. But I did the entire long form Yang and then the short form Yang later on when I graduated and moved back to New York. I studied with Master Chen, who's, that's funny, his name just skipped my mind for a moment, but it's interesting. But anyway, I studied the short form with him. So I wound up doing Tai Chi for a number of years, and that was a very strong experience of meditative movement. But we also did Taoist standing meditation, which I think is very similar to Zazen, even uses similar mudras.
Do you guys ever do the post thing where you're kind of standing like this?
Yeah, we did standing post, and we also did energy projection, where we would have the palms facing out against a wall. And I would see, I don't know if the drugs had any influence, but I'd see clouds of green energy forming on the walls.
Did you ever feel any tangible feelings of chi energy or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm inclined towards being able to feel and experience energy. Not everybody is, I have discovered, but I would experience those things pretty easily. And I felt the development and the flow of chi enormously through doing Tai Chi. I mean, it's really designed to open up those energy passageways and to really circulate the energy. And I experienced that very powerfully. What
does Tai Chi actually mean? Is the Chi and Tai Chi the same Chi as we're talking about in terms of energy?
It is the same. The Chi is Chi.
What does Tai mean?
Chi.
Yeah.
And the Tai is, I don't actually remember what the Tai means, but it's something like, it might be energy fist or energy hands.
Okay. And so would you talk about anything on the level of wisdom or philosophy with those teachers, or was it all about the techniques and the energy?
Well, in the Taoist tradition, they really don't talk. So, so it was all very much by doing and demonstration. And we would, we became friendly, and now I remembered my teacher's name. That's nice. William C.C. Chen, who was a master in the Yang lineage, descendant of the original Yangs, and he's now known as Grandmaster William Chen in his 80s. But but we'd go. He took us all out to a Chinese restaurant one time, and we chatted, and we would chat on the side a little bit. But when we were doing the forms, it was just watch and do, watch and do.
Do you ever do any Qigong, or was it just all Tai Chi?
All Tai Chi, and some of the applications of Tai Chi, like Tai Chi push hands.
Cool. So you that was your meditation experience at college. You didn't do any more TM or anything Buddhist like that?
No, Tai Chi was my main Eastern / meditative discipline in college, and the standing meditation, really is like a Zazen practice. So I did that regularly.
And did were you doing any reading? Did you take any Eastern philosophy courses, or read any Buddhist or Hindu or Advaita texts or anything like that in college?
During that time, I was in practice. I was doing Eastern, and in philosophy, I was doing all Western. So I was really immersed in Husserl and Merleau-Ponty.
And so did you graduate?
Yeah, I actually, at the time, it seemed like a lot of money. I think it cost $10,000 a year for college at that time. And my parents were not extremely rich, and they were paying for me. So I thought, there's no reason for me to hang around here. I pushed all my courses together and graduated in 3 years.
Wow.
And regretted it ever since. I still regret it. I should have stayed for 5 years, which some of the guys did.
Yeah.
It was great. And then I was thrown out into the world of being a busboy. And I made a transition between graduating and moving back to New York, that I was going to study acting. And that's sort of the next transition. But being an acting student in New York, after being sort of a philosopher, and everybody thought my work was really interesting, and then being a busboy and having people tell me to move along, get that bus tray out of here in the middle of the night.
The old joke. What do philosophy majors usually ask you after they graduate? Would you like cream with that, sir, or something like that?
That's true.
I think I mangled the joke, but it's something like that.
That's a very pertinent joke.
Did any thoughts you had no thoughts of going to grad school for philosophy or anything like that?
Well, I had a big argument with my dad about it, who said, what the hell are you doing? You should go to grad school and be a philosophy teacher. And I said, you know what? I felt like my studies were all from the neck up, and I wanted to do something that would integrate more with my body and nervous system and emotions. And I thought, I'll be an actor. And I had acted in school in the past and done a bunch of plays as a kid. So I thought, well, that'll be something that'll bring everything together. It's got the head, the heart, the emotions, the body. And I started some studies and supported them through doing various jobs. Looking back, doing all those odd jobs and various, sort of working class jobs was a good experience.
So what actually triggered the acting? I mean, it sounds like you had a casual interest in it, but not necessarily passion. Is that right?
Well, once I got out of school and I decided to study, I redeveloped a passion for it. I
see. And so you went to acting school.
I should add that I was in several plays in college.
Oh, okay.
Part of the drama circuit there too, and they were good, very interesting experiences. I was in school with some great actors.
So that kind of planted the seed of love of acting.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had it. I just sort of put it on hiatus for a while, but I did indulge it in school as well. Somehow I thought when I was in school that wasn't where I wanted to center. But I was playing in a jazz band. I was doing acting classes. I was studying Tai Chi, and then I was officially studying philosophy. So going into acting sort of, was a way of putting things together and seeing how I could integrate everything.
This is a bit of a tangent. Have you ever seen the HBO show called Barry?
I'm not sure. Oh, Barry.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen a little bit of it.
Yeah, I thought the way they did the whole acting classes was brilliant.
I'll have to go back to that and check it out.
It's really a masterpiece of the show. Anyway, way too much for transgression. So you're working kind of working class jobs, started training acting.
I was working as a busboy, and then I was working as a car transporter on Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. I had a lot of interesting stories from there, which I won't take your time with here, but really crazy people out there. And I worked as an assistant to a very colorful lawyer who slept in her office and had mafia guys in Florida for clients, and had her filing system as, Pendaflex folders piled up in one room that was reserved for all the Pendaflex folders. That was her file cabinet. So that was interesting. I had a lot of different job experiences like that. And then I wound up being sort of in the art department at HBO, which at that time was part of Time Inc. It might still be, and running their the big camera that they used to take photos for the HBO ads.
So you just did tons of stuff during that time.
I'm sorry. Yeah, well, once I got that job, I kind of stayed with it for a while. They let me work part-time and have benefits. And I went to massage school at that time and got licensed as a massage therapist, and then was working as a deep tissue massage therapist. I was taking yoga classes once I was back in New York and studying Iyengar Yoga, and then I became a yoga teacher. So I was working at HBO, teaching yoga classes, and then going to massage school, getting licensed, and doing yoga and massage.
And you were doing theater all through this.
And I was taking acting classes with some very strange and heavy duty people.
Yeah. And was this something you had to pay for, that you funded yourself? How did that work?
Yeah, that was out of my salary. Yeah, I paid for that. But they paid for a good portion of my massage school at HBO, because I was able to establish that the anatomy and physiology classes that I were taking were college level and the equivalent college credits. And they had an extended education program, so they paid for like 70% of my massage school.
So was the acting stuff you did, was it kind of avant-garde, or was it pretty vanilla stuff, or what kind of?
I did a lot of different kind of pretty normal acting things in New York. I mean, once I was still taking classes, but I would audition for various things. So I did some industrials where, I would play a BMW mechanic or something like that. I did a bunch of plays where I had small roles and got to do a bunch of different characters, which was actually really good experience for my acting and my teaching acting later. And I'm trying to think of, I did some avant-garde things too. I had a friend who did dance theater pieces, and I had a chance to write music and lyrics and perform with her in some of her pieces, and did some very modern operatic singing in one of her pieces as well, where we hired a classical composer. She did, because she paid for everything.
And we'll go back in time to how you discovered Buddhism and stuff, but can you talk a little bit about how kind of acting as almost a hobby turned into a career? Like, what was that path?
No, I was serious about being an actor at that point. I was beginning to make that my career. I was auditioning and getting acting jobs, but it was tough to break in and get jobs that would provide a living. So you're in that situation, which many actors are in New York or LA, of having a part-time or full-time job of some kind, and then auditioning and trying to get acting work. And they say that at any given time, 90% of actors are out of work. So that's a pretty tough gig. Most actors have to support themselves most of the time. So at that point, I didn't want to, keep working at a regular job. So I was seeing massage clients and teaching yoga classes, and that's how I was supporting my acting. And it was a nice lifestyle because I was equally interested in the yoga and massage and the acting process. They all sort of were a nice continuum for me, living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan at that point and being like a normal person in that community. Oh, what do you do? What do you do for your work? Oh, I do like 10 different new agey things. Oh,
Right.
that's cool.
And eventually you started teaching acting?
Yeah, it very interestingly, all the teaching that I've done seems kind of like a little bit woo-woo, but all the teaching I've done has happened without my initiating it. So I was always asked to teach for one strange reason or another. So I was in some kind of a group with a woman who had a yoga center. And one fine day she said to me, I can't teach my Tuesday night yoga class anymore. I think you should take it. Would you teach it for me? And I said, well, I don't know how to teach yoga. She says, oh, sure you do. You've been doing yoga for years. Go ahead and do it. I'm sure you can do it. So she trained me a little bit and had me watch her. And then I started taking over her Tuesday night yoga class. And it worked fine. To make a long story short on that one, the class ended. I got a scheduling conflict with my acting classes, which I was taking, not teaching. And so I had to leave that job. I got onto a bus, and on the bus where I was going, well, I guess that's it for me in yoga. I'm not going to teach yoga anymore. The bus stopped suddenly, and I fell against these 2 or 3 women who were in the bus, and we knocked into each other. And we got into a conversation, and I said, oh yeah, I was just teaching yoga, but I'm not going to teach anymore because there's a time conflict. And they said, we're looking for a yoga teacher. So I wound up teaching a small group of them up near Columbia. They were all Barnard students, and we wound up doing a group there. And then that expanded to my yoga teaching, which wound up at one point being like 6 classes a week that I was teaching. And so the massage came out of that too, because people were saying, I really like it the most when you come over and do the physical adjustments. I was like, okay, everybody wants physical adjustments. I might as well just do physical adjustments. So I went and learned and got the massage license so I could kind of do both of those together. And then for acting, one fine day, somebody who was teaching the beginning acting course at what was called in New York, the Discovery Center, kind of like the Learning Annex, said, oh, I can't teach the course this weekend. In fact, I have to stop teaching it. Would you take it for me? So I said, okay. So I taught this 2-day class, and afterwards the students said, so where can we take level 2? And I said, there is no level 2. I'm just a substitute. So they said, well, we want to take level 2. So I wound up setting up a class for them, and it wound up turning into my whole acting studio, which at one point I was also teaching like, I don't know, 6 or 8 classes a week.
Yeah, fascinating. So kind of going back in the time a little bit, can you talk about how you actually discovered Buddhism, like what the trigger was there, what your early experiences of Buddhism were?
Well, I was studying yoga pretty seriously and teaching yoga. And I'm trying to think of exactly how this happened. I mean, there's one experience that I go back to, which is, and I don't remember who this was, but there was a Zen master in town, and my friend Michael was studying Zen, and he was a regular student, and he invited me to come to this thing, and we sat down, and the guy gave a lecture for about 20 minutes, very energetically, and then at the end he said, but after all the talk is finished, there comes a time when you have to just shut up and sit down. And that started the sitting. And we all sat. It must have been Soto because we were facing the wall. And I thought, this is very interesting. And I had a nice experience of sitting. But I didn't pick it up after that. I didn't take it up regularly. But I would sit from time to time, and I would
sit on your own.
I would sit with my friend, or I would sit on my own. And I would also meditate as part of yoga. So at a certain point, one of my yoga teachers turned into a Vipassana teacher and started teaching Vipassana. I became interested in it, and I studied Vipassana with him. and then did Vipassana, sort of insight meditation, basically mindfulness meditation for a number of years. And that became sort of my Buddhist practice. I was already interested in Buddhism and Zen koans, and I was reading the Blue Cliff Record on my own.
Oh, you were?
Yeah, I always loved the koans. People would look at them and go like, what is that? That's nonsense. Doesn't mean anything. Why are you reading those? And I was like, no, they're great. So I had an affinity for that aspect of Zen as well. And so I had the Vipassana practice and on and off Zen practice. And then in more recent times, and maybe in 2012, my dad passed away, and was kind of a devastating blow, even though he was quite elderly at that point. And I was already back to Zen meditating on my own, but that made me, really take it seriously. And the issue of mortality really made me take a look at, reality and how I wanted to relate to it. And I thought, I really need to get to the bottom of this. So I started sitting more seriously. I found Al Rappaport, Fusho Al Rappaport online, and he became my teacher. And I started sitting with him in OMZ online and doing weekly sessions with him online. And then, made it to Florida a couple of times. He came and visited me a few times. And so that became my serious, that was the reinstigation of my serious sitting practice and the beginning of formal koan study as well in the White Plum tradition.
Did during your Vipassana phase, did you pretty much have a daily sitting practice?
Yeah, for periods I did. I would find that I would have periods where I'd get busy or resistant, and I would go off the cushion for a while, and then I would go back much more regularly again for a longish period of time. So it was sometimes discontinuous, but I had long periods of time where I was sitting every day as well.
And did you do any of those Vipassana retreats that they do?
I did one with my teacher at that time, and I enjoyed that very much.
What prior to Zen, before your father passed away, that kind of spurred you to more serious practice. What was your experience of Buddhism? Was it mostly just relaxed you? Did you feel like you were getting insight? I mean, what was drawing you back? Like what about Buddhism and Vipassana meditation was what was calling to you? What was the experience?
Well, basically sitting, and I still think of it this way, but sitting kind of became a refuge for me. When we talk about taking refuge, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, but for me, those all sort of, combine or overlap in sitting as a refuge. And I always felt that when I sat, that a couple of different things would take place. One is that for me, it was sort of very active to sit and just all the stuff that was accumulated or held in the nervous system would just unwind, and I could feel it kind of, coming out and dispersing. And so it would leave me in a more centered state. And then I would focus on just being present and see, whatever happens, kind of a Soto approach to sitting. But I found it a place to go that I naturally was inclined towards, that was very special. And it's, for me, people sometimes talk about Zen, everything is Zen, or Zen is how you apply it to life. And that's also very true in a certain way. But for me, and I think for most serious Zen people, the act of sitting on the cushion and what happens when you sit still and just, as I like to call it, come in for a landing, stop the passage of time in a certain way and not the flood of events, and just take stock of the basic reality of being. It's just different than anything else. It accomplishes a spiritual task just by doing it. That's really unique.
Did you think about awakening or enlightenment, aspire to it, or is it more just what is practice doing for me on a day-to-day basis? Like,
I I've always had a deep interest, yearning, craving for greater and greater awakening, enlightenment. And I think that's a thread throughout my entire life.
Mhm.
So, and I left out that during some of those years in between Vipassana and my own practice of Zen that I initiated myself,
Mhm.
I also was interested in Vedanta, and I was reading the teachings of Ramana Maharshi about finding the true self,
Mhm.
the root of the I.
Mhm.
It's similar to some Hatu work that we do in Zen, who am I?
Mhm.
And tracing the feeling of the I back to its source.
Mhm.
And did a couple of retreats with Ramesh Balsekar, who was the Dharma heir to Nisargadatta.
Mhm.
And so, those interests were continuous.
Mhm.
Just took
How would
different
you
forms.
compare and contrast the non-dual Advaita practice you did with the more Vipassana style? Did it seem to all flow together, or did they seem distinct and even?
I've maintained an interest in Vedanta as well, and it's just interesting. I don't like to completely mix them together. I don't see it as a mush. They're two different approaches to the realization of the nature of the self or the realization of reality. So I don't really mix them when I'm doing Zen. I think in Zen terms, and maybe I'm informed by some of these other disciplines that I've done, but
Mhm.
I really try to adhere to what I consider to be kind of the Zen way or Zen principles.
Mhm.
And when I'm looking into Vedanta, the more Indian form of non-dualism, um, I think of it in a slightly different way, use slightly different terms. But I'm able to switch back and forth for some
Mhm.
reason. I don't know if everybody could.
Well, what do you see as the differences between the two traditions?
Well, Vedanta posits a very serious, actual, existent true self.
Mhm.
And the realization of that as one's self, as one's actual self, is the goal of Vedanta.
Mhm.
And there's something like that in Zen. Certainly, if you awaken to your true nature, you could say that sounds kind of similar.
Mhm.
But the idea that the true nature that one awakens to in Zen is insubstantial and empty.
Mhm.
And while it may include everything in a way, it's also not it's not a self in a sense. It's a true nature, but it's not a substantive self.
Mhm.
So for me personally, um, I think they come together in a place where that makes sense in both terms. But
Mhm.
I think in Zen terms, there's this safety mechanism of not reifying or objectifying a self that's a thing or an entity.
Mhm.
And all of Buddhism, and especially Zen, is very firm about that.
Mhm.
Don't establish a self. That's like a permanent, unchanging substrate.
Nicely said. Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about what your early days of working with Al Roshi was like?
Yeah, I would say that it's been a pretty continuous process from beginning to end. From the time we started working together on koans, which is the main way that we've interacted,
Mhm.
and he has a very personable, sort of non-formal way of doing things. That's Al's style.
Mhm.
And so we would chat a little bit. We developed a friendship,
Mhm.
and then we would get into the koan work, and
Mhm.
it was very much okay. So you know what do you have to say about the koan or whatever, and like, nope, go back,
Mhm.
uh, type of thing.
Mhm.
Um, and so it was both an informal and a very definitive process at the same time.
Mhm.
Um, with some koans, I struggled. Other ones, I didn't struggle as much. I seemed to,
Mhm.
get them sort of intuitively more quickly. But
Mhm.
over the years that we've been doing this, we've developed what I think is a really nice working relationship, and
Mhm.
we've talked a little bit more about things around the koans in the
Mhm.
later work,
Mhm.
as well as working on them directly. And so I think that we have a nice relationship, both as a teacher-student, which we still are, and I have an awful lot to learn from Al. But at the same time, we also, have a kind of a nice relationship as older teacher, younger teacher, or something like that, even though we're similar ages.
Yes, some teachers are intimidating. Did you never feel that intimidated by him? Because people don't know, he's a very warm and gregarious and soft edges type of person,
I would never feel intimidated by him personally. In other words, he's not somebody who is threatening. Like you say, he's very warm and personable. But I would sometimes I would feel fear or anxiety sometimes around the koans and, what was going to happen with the koan. So that was more about my relationship to the work than it was about my relationship to Al. But one of the reasons that I actually trust and like Al is because he's not like that. He's not hierarchical, and he doesn't establish a kind of air of authoritarianism about his teaching. And I was kind of finished with all of that some years ago. I had a very harsh and difficult teacher in my acting training. And he was sort of fashioned himself as a kind of a Zen master. He would, be very cut people down and somewhat beyond that, somewhat of a cultish figure. And, once I had gone through that and managed to get out with part of myself intact, I said, I'm really going to the part of me that's left, I'm going to kind of hang on to it and not subject it to that kind of thing. And it also determined to me that I was not going to teach that way. I started out being a little bit more critical in my approach when I would teach students. But I realized rather quickly I didn't really want to teach that way, and that there was another way to do things. And I don't know if most people even accept this, but the idea is that if you are incisive and you pay attention to the student and you encourage them to go further, or if you see them taking a misstep and you help to correct it, you can do all of that positively. You don't have to say, no, that's wrong, you're stupid or whatever, don't be a fool. You don't have to indulge in negativity or being the authority and I have the power, I can tell you what to do. It's more like encouraging someone to explore their own process. And I so much more like that way of teaching than anything else that now I find it abrasive if anybody puts on those kinds of teacherly airs and tries to lord it over someone. Although I have to say that when I was in Melbourne to see Al this last time, I went to this retreat just a couple of weeks ago. He hit me with the kiyosako.
Okay.
And on both shoulders. And, so I just want to report that. No, it was fun.
Yeah. Yeah, that, I haven't been hit too many times with one, but it was more physically traumatic than I was expecting. And the first person who hit was like this little old lady, I'm like, this isn't going to be so bad. And this, whoa,
Yeah, he was just being he was just being mischievous. It was really quite funny.
Yeah. Yeah, when that's done right, it's almost like what's that where they put the needles in you? Acupuncture or acupressure, there almost seems to be a chi type of thing to it.
I think it does activate your chi, your flow.
Yeah.
Just to say one more thing about Al is that what really appealed to me about Al is that he absolutely didn't put on any airs as a teacher or a master or whatever. He would just be absolutely ordinary and be himself, and he's like that. If he has something to say, he just says it. He has very deep understanding, but he expresses it in a kind of ordinary way. The things he says may not be ordinary, and that may even be a little deceiving sometimes because it sounds like he's saying something ordinary even when he's not. But he speaks in a calm way, and he talks as just like having in a conversational tone. And I think that that's kind of an achievement in a way, because I find that the teacher persona, although I guess you could use that skillfully to some effect if you wanted to utilize it as a tool with students. But I much prefer to just see someone as they are and just have the regular person there, they happen to be skillful as a teacher, so they're teaching, but it's not like they're the show.
Yep.
And I was really attracted to that. I don't want to, say this as in a way that sounds silly, but it's like Al doesn't have much of an ego. He doesn't need to prove anything.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm a bit of an outside whole scene with you guys. I do koans with one of Al's students, but I'm not involved with the Florida group. But the one thing I like about Al is that he seems to really, some teachers, it almost seems like, it's rare, but I've definitely seen it happens where I feel like the teacher's like holding back students to kind of burnish their own ego, whereas Al seems, he's all about empowering people, and it's it's not all about him.
Absolutely. And I think he looks at students too, and we've talked about this sometimes, he looks at their potential and says, this person might be able to really do something in the future, if they develop in a certain direction. And he's very interested in cultivating people to realize their own potential. It's not about him. And and by the way, that's another example of me, not trying to teach. First there's the yoga, then there's the acting. And then when I went down to, retreat with Al, the first time I'd been down there in person and met the group and whatnot, there was a teacher there who, kind of looked at me and said, "Why haven't you started teaching yet?" One of the teachers, who was kind of discerning. And I said, "Well, I was thinking about it. There was one or two students in DC, and Al had been talking to me about it, and I had made some contact with people here in DC, but I said, okay, I better get with it." And Al said, "Yeah, you should do that." So then he would decide along the way if he wanted to. At a certain point, he made me assistant teacher, et cetera, et cetera. But I never had that in my mind. It's just something that when he felt the time was right, he would just say, "Okay, now you're this."
So in the kind of the white plum curriculum that you're studying in, it starts with, the miscellaneous, mu and the other miscellaneous koans. There's 107 of them.
Yeah.
And then there's the Gateless Gate, and then there's the Blue Cliff Record, and then there's the Book of Serenity, and then Kazon's Transmission of the Lamp or Light.
Right.
Yeah. So as you were going through those, did you feel the nature of the koans changed, or did you feel like the style of practice and the kind of the spirit of the koans was pretty static through the process? Or do you feel,
it definitely changes to in certain ways.
Is that something you feel comfortable talking about, or is that given away too much?
Yeah, and like in a general way, sure. I mean, basically, the first set of koans are really a mixed bag because some of them are very simple and some of them are more esoteric and more challenging. If you have a koan about the mountains walking along the river, that's a little challenging to. You can't solve that conceptually. But it's also just one thing. So there are koans like that, the sound of one hand. It's just one thing. You're just presented with this problem, and you have to deal with it. You have to embody it, and again, you can't solve that conceptually. So, but when you get into the Blue Cliff Record, it might be a whole story. One day the master went wandering in the mountains. When he came back, the head monk questioned him and said, "Where have you been, master?" And the master said, "Oh, I've been wandering in the mountains." And the head monk says, "Where did you go?" "First I went pursuing the fragrant grasses, then I returned following the falling flowers." The head monk says, "How much like the sense of springtime?" And the master says, "It even surpasses the autumn dew dripping on the lotuses." And the head monk bows and says, "Thank you for your reply." So how do you even know what to work on? So you have to go into this whole narrative and find the turning word, find the point of the koan and embody it. So it's a little more complicated when you get to those narrative types of koans, but they're wonderful.
And how about the transmission of light? How do you feel that I'm sorry, the Book of Serenity. How did you feel that different from the other ones? If it did.
Yeah, each one of them has its own kind of flavor to it, you know. Right now, I'm in the middle of the Denkaroku, the transmission of the light or lamp. I'm trying to kind of go back to the flavor of the Book of Serenity. It's funny, the flavor of the Blue Cliff record and the Mumonkan are much more clear to me. The Mumonkan is also, a lot of times, it's very problematic, short koans. Gateless Gate, yeah. The Book of Serenity, again, I wish I could glance at it to answer your question, but it's got, you know, longer stories in it too. I love Al laughs because I love all the koans. I mean, there aren't any that I don't like. Some of the ones in the Book of Serenity are just profoundly wonderful. You know, they'll just open your mind just by reading them, you know, let alone quote solving them. You know, it's one about breathing and breathing in, you know, the outside and breathing out the inside. I don't remember the exact wording, but very beautiful koans. I wish I could say more about it, but it's sort of elusive to me at the moment. But they're again really, really beautiful, longer, storyiistic koans. And then the transmission of the light has a very specific flavor to it because they're all supposed to be enlightenment stories. They're about how one master passed on or helped the you know, his transmission, helped the next patriarch to awaken. So they're all, but you know, so they're very interesting stories too. Some of them are mythological, but in nature, but they're also kind of elusive and have very interesting points. But they're beautiful stories, and they have Keizan's commentaries, which are, and his teishos, which are wonderful. Some of them are very incisive and really give you a good feeling of the underpinnings of Soto Zen.
So you know, you had a long history of body work, both with the Hatha yoga and the actual body work, you know, the massaging. And then of course you did the Tai Chi with the, you know, the energy work. Do you think any of that has been applicable or helped or been relevant to your Zen practice at all? Like, do you
Yeah,
see
I think.
this?
I mean, I don't know. I think people have their own configurations for their own practice, but I mean, I personally would recommend yoga for anybody meditating. I mean, it totally opens up the nervous system. It relaxes and stretches out the body. It's kind of how you want to be, you know, before you sit.
Yeah.
So for me, they went together really beautifully. I mean, after, and I'm not doing as much yoga these days as I used to, and I think I really miss it. I'm going to try to reinvigorate that practice. I say to myself, but it really makes the zazen much easier. You can sit and you're already feeling pretty open, pretty centered. So it's a nice combination.
So you're a relatively new teacher. You know, you've had a few students. Have you had situations where students come to you with kind of what seems to be almost what should go to a therapist, you know, kind of psychological issues, and how do you handle that? Do you try to deal on those levels, or, I mean, I think this is something that American teachers often have to deal with. You know, where does the line between helping someone psychologically and more classical Zen practice? Has this been, or maybe it hasn't been an issue for you at all? Or, you know, can you speak to that at all?
Well, it's that's an interesting point. When we do our little sitting group, which it's small enough that it's not like a big group, where we have time, and I've had the inclination to sometimes say, at the end of sitting, we'll sit, I'll give a talk, but there's time to kind of ask people what the experience was like for them, or if they have any questions or anything on their mind. So people have talked in that group to a certain extent about what was going on in their lives and how their practice applied to that.
Mhm.
I think there have been times when it's gotten a little bit more into the psychological state that people are in, but my approach to looking at that in a Zen group is different than it would be if I was doing psychotherapy.
Mhm.
In other words, I'm not there to go deeply into what's causing someone to feel a certain way or to get to the root of their personal situation.
Mhm.
But what I can do is allow for some clarification and clearing of whatever that obstruction is, and kind of look at it in the light of their practice as well.
Mhm.
So it's just a different focus, and it's not going as deeply as you might in the psychotherapeutic direction, but there's room to allow that to kind of resolve itself to a certain extent and open up into practice.
Great. Okay. Well, before we get into how people can get a hold of you, is there anything else you want to talk about, or anything you want to add about Zen, or your opinions of Zen, or your practice, or anything about like that?
Yeah, I guess I would just say, as a kind of summary of my way of looking at things, is that there are kind of two aspects to Zen that aren't really separate. One of them is awakening or becoming more awake.
Mhm.
And in some schools, that's a very definitive, big realization that happens as a singular event, like a big kensho, a
Mhm.
big awakening that kind of shakes everything up.
Mhm.
Um, and in Soto, to a certain extent, and maybe in some other schools, it's more of a kind of a gradual opening into
Mhm.
being yourself and letting go of the conceptual obstructions that
Mhm.
you've had, misdefining yourself and misdefining reality.
Mhm.
And I think that both of those aspects of Zen are important.
Mhm.
I think that it's good if you are fortunate enough to do the work and have a big opening into a direct experience of your true nature, that's really valuable.
Mhm.
On the other hand, it can also give you the mistaken notion that that's the path and that that's the practice. Really, to me, it's like putting uh, a big new motor into your car or something, but you still have to, become more skillful at driving the car and also figure out where you want the car to go.
Mhm.
So the second aspect of Zen, which I think is where it always comes back to, is how we relate to the moment and how we relate to this reality right here.
Mhm.
And I think it's very difficult for me and for most of us to totally 100% resolve that this moment, sitting in a chair with a computer, looking at the rug, in my peripheral vision, that's it. You know?
Mhm.
That's really where I am. I'm not in fantasy land with something, better happening in the future. I'm not in the exciting drama of trying to resolve my past. I'm
Mhm.
here here, with a quiet room, having a conversation,
Mhm.
and to resolve that that's enough,
Mhm.
that simple reality is good, that's satisfying.
Mhm.
Instead, we have a human impulse to want to be somewhere else, make it different, make it better. And I think that ultimately the real practice is, like, as I've said, my favorite expression, coming in for a landing
Mhm.
where there's no more overlay, or at least you can let it subside for a period of time of, it should be more like this, it should be more like that, but you're really here. And
How do you?
then
Oh,
I think something opens up and illuminates the current situation when you're not fighting it.
how do you feel koan work integrates into that type of practice, or if it does?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in a couple of different ways. One is that the koans take you into, what people call your intuitive nature.
Mhm.
Um, and that's a different part of the mind. It's not the part of the mind that struggles with reality.
Mhm.
So it brings you into, you could say, more into your enlightened mind.
Mhm.
Also, in order to really work on koans, you have to be present and you have to embody them. You have to make them your present reality and, let them take over. And there's a kind of being present that is involved in that. But the koans too, open, like sitting, open back up into what's here, what's now. What is this really like?
Great. Thank you. So if someone wanted to get a hold of you, what's the best way at this point?
My email is good. epsteinrob@yahoo.com.
Mhm.
And, just like my name, so not too difficult to spell if you see my name. And it's also listed on the Open Mind Zen OMZ website,
Mhm.
as well as the Saturday sitting time of 1 p.m. So, but people can contact me through that email. That's the best way.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time.
It's great to talk to you.
Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, you too.